Let's start with Fight of the Year. I think it's a fair enough place to start more than anything, considering that this podcast is about fights and fighting. The best fight of 2024 is probably the most heralded category. Best fight of the year. We're going to start with Islam Makhachev versus Dustin Poirier. Now, I was at this fight live, so I was a bit biased picking it here, but it was an awesome matchup where we saw a great champion in Islam Makhachev get pretty much pushed to the limit by the grizzled veteran challenger in Dustin Poirier. Now, Makhachev did end up pulling out that submission in the 5th round, but Poirier was, bloodying him up. He was defending the takedowns well, especially in those middle rounds. And had a great account for himself, I think. And, Poirier has now since mentioned that he wants to take one more fight and then retire. But I do feel like this was a perfect swan song for him as far as a underdog performance where he, really showed a lot of heart and had great success against a guy who everybody thought would beat him up in 2 rounds, myself included. So shouts out to Islam and Dustin for putting on that fight. Islam was able to pull out that finish in the last round. I personally had him up 3-1 going into the 5th. But, any other judge could have had it 2-2 or 3-2, or 3-1 for Dustin. So, maybe not 3-1 for Dustin, but they could have scored it 2-2 for sure. So, him thinking that he needs a finish in that 5th round and then getting it, hats off to the champ. The guy earned it. So that's our first nomination. Next nomination would be Max Holloway versus Justin Gaethje. I think this is going to be on a lot of people's list for Fight of the Year, but in my opinion, it was a bit too one-sided for me. Max was pretty much putting on a masterclass. Justin Gaethje had a couple moments. There was that knockdown where the cage saved Max, but besides that, it was really the Max Holloway show. The ending was absolutely phenomenal and likely going to be our knockout of the year, but for me, I feel like the fight didn't live up to what I would consider to be Fight of the Year. That being said, it was an awesome fight and definitely one that will go down in the history books forever just for that finish alone. Next, we have Orolbai versus Rebecki. This was a awesome fight from a couple weeks ago that built it up really well. First round went to Rebecki, second round went to Orolbai, and then the third round, Rebecki was whooping his ass, and then Orolbai won the last half of the round. So it was a very, very tightly contested fight, a very close fight, but Mateusz Rebecki was able to get that victory in the underdog spot there. It was an awesome fight, man. Really incredible fight, and when I was watching it, I felt like it was one of the first fights I've ever seen. That feeling like when you first started watching MMA and you were like, holy shit, this is insane. Like, that's the kind of chills that I got watching that fight, so I felt I needed to put it up for the nomination. Next nomination we have is Deiveson Figueiredo versus Petr Yan. This was another incredible fight. A little bit one-sided, but certainly competitive throughout. Both guys showed great adjustments to each other's games. Both guys showed wrinkles that they've always shown, but they showed it in different contexts in this fight. Figueiredo landed some beautiful takedowns, landed some awesome straight rights, dropped Yan at one point. Yan was landing incredible uppercuts, the clinch trips that he has, of course. It was a really beautiful fight where we saw two fighters who have very interesting and entertaining styles meet and use those styles to pick each other apart. Petr Yan did end up getting the victory there, and it was well-deserved. But regardless, an awesome fight. Not sure if I'd put it as Fight of the Year, but definitely deserved the nomination. John Silva versus Drew Dober. Again, this was an incredible barn burner matchup between two guys who really just love to entertain. John Silva ended up getting the TKO by way of cut in the 3rd round, I believe. But regardless, that whole fight was just, barn burner, man. The spinning elbows that Silva lands, the hooks from both guys. We didn't see a ton of grappling in this fight, if any. I don't remember any grappling exchanges, really. But regardless, it was a phenomenal fight. Tatsuro Taira versus Brandon Royval is another great fight that we got late in the year. Back and forth fight, really close, really fun. This is one of those fights where, and in general, these kind of fights are my favorite historically. Fights like Carlos Condit versus Robbie Lawler, fights like Johnny Hendricks versus Robbie Lawler, Frankie Edgar versus Gray Maynard. You know, these fights where it's 5 rounds and one guy wins the first round, the next guy wins the second, next guy wins the third, next guy wins the fourth, and then, you know, the fifth is what decides it. Adesanya versus Gastelum is another great example of that type of storyline to a fight. And Tatsuro Taira versus Brandon Royval fit that bill, in my opinion. Royval winning the first, third, and fifth rounds, and Tatsuro winning the second and fourth. Great fight. Again, a veteran versus a young, hungry prospect. The veteran turned back the prospect in this matchup in a split decision, but I felt like Brandon Royval did enough to win that fight. And this is another fight. This is a fight that gets this nomination not only for the barn burner action, but because there was grappling exchanges that were really exciting, there was striking exchanges that were really exciting, there was clinch exchanges that were really exciting. Altogether, every phase of the fight these guys went to, they brought it, and they fought their hearts out. And yeah, definitely deserves a nomination for Fight of the Year. Now, the last nomination is Daniel Zellhuber versus Esteban Ribovic. This was at UFC 306 at the Sphere. I think it was 306. Yeah, I think it was 306. Well, either way, it was at the Sphere. Phenomenal fight, man. I mean, just right from the bell, these guys are throwing incredible combinations at each other. Non-stop action, non-stop pace. Again, not a ton of grappling in this fight, but just an absolute barn burner, man. If you guys are going to watch any fight from this list, I highly recommend you watch this one, Zellhuber versus Ribovic. Both guys taking lumps out of each other, and very competitive rounds. I felt as though it was 1-1 going into the third, and then that third round, Esteban Ribovic really put the pace on Daniel Zellhuber and had him stumbling around the ring, and Zellhuber, even while hurt, was coming back with some great strikes of his own. We saw some really beautiful boxing combinations in this fight. We saw some really beautiful setups for the kicks. Again, not a ton of grappling, but the few grappling exchanges that we saw were tightly competitive. And for me, because this fight was bell-to-bell action, because it was edge of your seat the whole time, we saw two guys who, you know, Zellhuber, I think, has a bit of shine. Ribovic, a little bit of shine from getting that head kick knockout over Terrence McKinney. But relatively speaking, compared to the other names on this list, these are two relatively unknown fighters, and they absolutely put on a war. They put on, in my opinion, what should be the fight of the year. And we are going to give the fight of the year award to Daniel Zellhuber and Esteban Ribovic for their war at the Sphere earlier this year. So congratulations to them. Incredible fight. Highly recommend you guys check that one out. This was the fight that, when I rewatched all these fights, it stood out the most to me. I think with the context of, you know, Islam and Dustin, with the context of even Tyra versus Royval or Max and Justin, you can think that in the moment that those fights were better or, you know, standouts. I mean, they certainly are standouts, but if you strip away all the extraneous factors, the name value, you know, the championship potential, etc., these guys put on an absolute war. So shouts out to Ribovic and Zellhuber, and you guys got our fight of the year for 2024. Congratulations. All right.